Hello and welcome to another teaching from 119 Ministries. Our ministry believes that the whole Bible is true and applicable to our lives today. If you'd like to learn more about what we believe and teach, please visit us at testeverything.net. We hope you enjoy studying and testing the following teaching.
Did Paul teach against the law of Moses? Are modern views on Paul misleading? What surprising news did James share? Why were thousands of Jewish believers still zealous? Were rumors about Paul abandoning the law true? How did Paul dispel these falsehoods? What was the significance of Paul's Nazirite vow? Did Paul really affirm his commitment to the law? Was Paul putting on an act? Setting the record straight. Paul and the law of Moses.
Did the Apostle Paul teach believers to abandon the law of Moses? Many modern Christian teachers claim that he did. For instance, while citing Paul's writings, popular megachurch pastor Andy Stanley claims that the law has no relevance to Christians at all. In fact, he says Christians shouldn't even keep the 10 Commandments. Quote, Jesus followers are dead to the law. The law, along with the covenant arrangement that served as the context for the law, has no say in the life of a believer, none. According to Paul, Jesus followers are dead to the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments have no authority over you, none. To be clear, thou shalt not obey the 10 Commandments. More recently, Christian teacher R.L. Solberg has echoed these radical sentiments from Andy Stanley and takes it a step further. He claims that following the law of Moses is incompatible with following the Messiah and, in fact, hinders our relationship with the Messiah. Quote, does it make sense to follow Jesus and Moses? Well, the short answer is no. I don't think that makes sense at all. In fact, it dilutes our devotion to Jesus and makes us double-minded in our pursuit of God. So, some modern teachers are fully convinced that Paul's teachings are opposed to the notion that Christians should obey God's law given through Moses. This idea that Paul taught Christians to abandon the law of Moses is a popular rumor. What's interesting is that these modern teachers are not the only ones who have believed this rumor. Some people in Paul's own time also heard this rumor and thought that Paul taught against the law. Apparently, this rumor has persisted for a long time. But is it true? Did Paul really teach Christians to abandon the law of Moses? Well, why don't we consider how Paul himself directly addressed this rumor? Let's take a look. Paul sets the record straight. In Acts 21, Paul visits James in Jerusalem. It should be noted that the events described in Acts 21 are widely considered to have occurred after Paul wrote Galatians. But in any case, when Paul arrives in Jerusalem, James shares some exciting news with him. He tells Paul that there are thousands of Jews who have come to believe in Jesus, or Yeshua as he was called in the first century. James also remarks that these Jewish believers in Yeshua are all zealous for the law. Acts 21 verse 20, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. They are all zealous for the law. So, decades after the Messiah's resurrection, thousands of Jewish Christians were zealous for the law. For these Christians, keeping the law of Moses continued to be an important part of living out their faith in Messiah. This is significant and certainly not what we would expect if the apostles taught that Yeshua's work on the cross had made the law irrelevant. But perhaps even more significant is what this passage teaches us about Paul's view of the law. James goes on to inform Paul that the Jerusalem Christians have heard a rumor that he taught against the law of Moses. Acts 21 verse 21, and they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. So, the rumor that Paul taught believers to abandon the law of Moses was spreading among the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. If this rumor were true, like some modern teachers would have you believe, this moment would have been a great time for Paul to confirm it. If Paul really taught that followers of Jesus are no longer required to keep the Mosaic law, we would expect him to have admitted it when directly confronted with such a claim. What we would not expect is for Paul to dispute this rumor, and yet that is precisely what he goes on to do, as we will see. James instructs Paul to join others in a vow and to participate in public worship at the Jerusalem temple. According to James, doing these things will refute the rumor that Paul taught believers to abandon the law and will demonstrate that Paul himself kept the law. Acts 21 verses 22 through 24. What then is to be done? They, that is, those believers who heard the rumor that Paul taught against the law, will certainly hear that you have come. Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. The vow described in this passage fits the description of a Nazirite vow, which is a special kind of vow that was prescribed in the law of Moses and which required giving an offering at the temple. James explicitly states that the purpose of Paul taking this vow is to refute the rumor that he taught believers to abandon the law of Moses. Again, if the rumor were true, if Paul taught against Christians keeping the law, we would expect Paul not to go along with James' request. If keeping the law really hindered a Christian's relationship with the Messiah, then surely Paul would correct James' terrible error. But that is not what happens. Let's see. Acts 21, verse 26. Then Paul took the men, and the next day he purified himself along with them and went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled and the offering presented for each one of them. Here we see that Paul went along with James' instruction. He took part in a vow and participated in temple worship to reassure the Jerusalem Christians that he lived, quote, in observance of the law. So instead of confirming the rumor that he taught believers to forsake Moses, Paul took significant steps here to dispel that rumor. Why did Paul make such an effort to demonstrate that he did not teach Christians to abandon the law of Moses? The simplest explanation is that Paul did not believe that Christians should abandon the law of Moses. Paul was setting the record straight. Dr. David Rudolph explains the significance of Paul's actions. Quote, Acts 21 verses 17 through 26 is not simply an example of Paul participating in ritual purity and paying for sacrifices. Paul's actions were intended to set the record straight concerning his way of life with respect to the law of Moses. His statement of clarification was made in the temple courts before myriads of strict Torah-observant Jews who understood the meaning of his actions. While this explanation goes against what some modern teachers would have you believe, it takes the biblical text at face value and does not require us to bring any prior assumptions to the text. All we have to do is read it. People heard that Paul taught believers to abandon the law. James tells Paul to participate in a vow and temple worship to disprove that rumor. Paul participates in a vow and temple worship. It would seem that Paul followed James' instruction because he wanted people to know that he did not teach against the law. Did Paul deceive the Jerusalem Christians? Despite the straightforward reading of the text, some try to suggest that Paul was merely putting on an act to appease the Jerusalem Christians. That is to say, Paul's actions gave the Jerusalem Christians false assurance that he affirmed the law, when in reality, he didn't. Some have tried to make this argument on the basis of Paul's evangelistic strategy described in 1 Corinthians 9. Here is Solberg making this argument. Quote, Paul himself, for the sake of the gospel, became all things to all men. He says in 1 Corinthians 9:20, To the Jews I became as a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. And he did. We see that in Acts 21. Paul had no problem taking those 4 men under a vow and purifying himself along with them and paying their expenses. To his contemporaries, Paul looked like a practicing Jew, even though he was a firm believer in the gospel of Jesus. Was Paul insincere in his efforts? Was his intention to trick the Jerusalem Christians into thinking that he did not teach believers to forsake Moses, even though he actually did teach believers to forsake Moses? Aside from this being a very strange and unethical thing for Paul to do, where do we find support for such an idea in the passage itself? Nothing in the text indicates that Paul was attempting to create a false impression. One has to approach the text already assuming such an idea. Again, the text itself leads one to conclude that Paul's actions were intended to debunk the rumor that he taught believers to abandon the law of Moses. Acts 21, verse 24. Take these men and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. Furthermore, the idea that Paul was just putting on a show is not consistent with the rest of the book of Acts. After this event in Acts 21, on 3 separate occasions, Paul declares that he lived in accordance with the law of Moses when confronted with accusations that he didn't. Acts 24, verses 14 through 17. But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. So I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man. Now after several years I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. Acts 25, verse 8. Paul argued in his defense, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. Acts 28, verse 17. After 3 days he called together the local leaders of the Jews, and when they had gathered, he said to them, Brothers, though I had done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans. This consistent depiction of Paul affirming his commitment to the law of Moses holds significance within Luke's narrative in Acts, as Rudolph writes. Quote, from a narrative point of view, each of these confirmations point back to Acts 21, verses 17 through 26. One may ask what more Luke could have included in his narrative to express that Paul was a Torah-observant Jew. Acts is replete with statements that describe Paul as faithful to Jewish law and custom. Statements to the contrary are consistently identified as false rumors. So, those who want to say that Paul actually did teach that believers were not required to follow God's law need to explain not just Acts 21, but also these other passages. Where is the textual evidence that Paul is being insincere in any of these instances? Isn't it more reasonable to take Paul at his word? Isn't it more reasonable to say that the rumor about Paul was not true, which is exactly what James and Paul were trying to demonstrate in Acts 21? Another problem is that if Paul were simply trying to trick the Jerusalem Christians about his true teachings, the Jerusalem Christians would have soon found out about it. What then? Paul's efforts would be completely undermined, as Rudolph writes. Quote, Paul would have certainly known that the Jerusalem community would continue to receive reports about his life and teachings after he left Jerusalem. Is it likely that Paul publicly set the record straight that he remained a Torah-observant Jew, but that he gave no thought to the fact that his testimony would shortly thereafter be contradicted by his actions? Was Paul so facile? Since there is nothing in the book of Acts that lends support to the idea that Paul was just pretending to be Torah observant in Acts 21, some have tried to find support for this idea elsewhere. As we noted earlier, they say that Paul explains this evangelistic strategy in 1 Corinthians 9:20. 1 Corinthians 9:20, to the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. Drawing from this passage, it is argued that Paul kept the law only when it was useful to win others. He didn't keep the law out of sincerity or conviction, but simply so he could appease Jews and have opportunity to preach to them, and Acts 21 is an example of him doing just that. But what evidence do we have to confirm that the evangelistic strategy described in 1 Corinthians 9 is being implemented in Acts 21? Such a notion is, once again, just assumed. Also, there would be no reason to do this in Acts 21. The Jews in Acts 21 are already followers of the Messiah. Paul does not need to try to win them to the gospel. They've already been won. It should also be noted that the idea that Paul kept the law only in the company of Jews and abandoned it in other situations is a misreading of his evangelistic strategy in 1 Corinthians 9. When Paul says that he is not personally under the law, he does not mean to convey that he is not personally obedient to the law. While the phrase under the law is often interpreted as meaning obedient to the law, that is not what the phrase means in this verse. The context makes this clear since, earlier in the same chapter, Paul appeals to the law of Moses as authoritative and applicable to his readers. 1 Corinthians 9 verses 8 through 9. Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. It wouldn't make sense for Paul to appeal to the law as authoritative for his readers, only to say that he doesn't consider the law authoritative in his own life just a few verses later. Not only that, but in the verse immediately following Paul's statement that he is not personally under the law, he emphasizes that he is not outside the law of God. 1 Corinthians 9 verse 21. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. The Bible and other Jewish writings consistently use the phrase law of God in reference to the law of Moses. Also, Paul himself uses the phrase law of God to describe the law of Moses in other passages. All the evidence indicates that the law of God and the law of Moses are the same thing. Thus, when Paul states that he does not go, quote, outside the law of God, he means that he does not violate the law of Moses when ministering to those who are, quote, outside the law, that is, to those who are sinners. Paul does not violate the law of God when ministering to sinners, but remains under the, quote, law of Christ. The law of Christ is not something different from the law of Moses, but rather refers to Christ's halakha, that is, his interpretation of the law of Moses, specifically reflected in Christ's loving interaction with sinners, as Rudolph writes. Quote, contextually, Paul's use of enemos Christo in the law of Christ in 1 Corinthians 9:21b would seem to represent the law of Moses in the hand of Christ as iterated in Christ's association with sinners. The scholar J. Brian Tucker echoes this perspective. Quote, Paul has come to follow a lenient halakha with regard to the Gentiles based on the paradigmatic model of Christ who ate with sinners but remained Torah observant. Being under Christ's law was a lenient halakha that formed the social identity of the early Christ movement. So, the text of 1 Corinthians itself presents Paul as one who follows the law of Moses as interpreted by Christ. Like Christ, Paul eats with sinners but does not violate the law. What then does Paul mean when he says, to those under the law I became as one under the law? If Paul is already obedient to the law of Moses, what is he trying to convey with this statement? Well, just as the phrase law of Christ refers to Christ's interpretation of the law of Moses, the phrase under the law in this context should also be understood in terms of halakha or interpretation of the law. Scholars J. Brian Tucker, David Rudolph, and others explain that under the law here refers to the Pharisees' strict interpretation of the law, specifically in regard to table fellowship. Table fellowship refers to shared meals with particular customs and standards of ritual purity, and these traditions often differed among various groups, with some groups having stricter standards than others. The notion that Paul is accommodating different standards of table fellowship in 1 Corinthians 9 is derived from the broader context of 1 Corinthians, which largely addresses controversies surrounding shared meals. So, when Paul says he becomes as one under the law, he is expressing his willingness to abide by the Pharisees' strict interpretations of the law during table fellowship, even though he personally doesn't hold to the Pharisees' standards. For example, the Pharisees avoided not just foods that were prohibited by God's law, but also some foods that were permitted by God's law. They considered biblically clean meat defiled or common if it was purchased from a Gentile, even though the law does not prohibit eating meat purchased from a Gentile. Josephus confirms that the Pharisees, quote, have delivered to the people a great many observances by succession from their fathers, which are not written in the laws of Moses. For instance, the Pharisees enforced extra-biblical hand-washing rituals before shared meals and generally avoided eating any meat sold in the Gentile marketplaces. Paul did not agree with the Pharisees' rules, but for the sake of the gospel, he accommodated them. That means he would not eat anything that would cause them to stumble, even though eating lamb chops purchased from a Gentile butcher does not violate God's law. He may have even ritually washed his hands before shared meals. In any case, that is more likely what Paul means to convey when he says he became as one under the law. He means that he accommodated Pharisaic tradition when eating with them. As Tucker writes, quote, Lightfoot and Bachmuel have suggested another reading for under the law, one that refers either to those holding to a more strict interpretation of the law, or more specifically to the Pharisees. This view is preferred for the following reasons. First, in Philippians 3:5, Paul says of himself, as to the law, a Pharisee. This makes for a good conceptual parallel to the language of 1 Corinthians 9:20. Second, Pharisees were known for a more strict observance of the law compared to the halakha of Jesus. Third, this understanding distinguishes the small group from the previously mentioned larger group, i.e. the Jews. This distinction between the Pharisees and the rest of the Jews is furthermore evident in Mark 7 verse 3, the Pharisees and all the Jews, and Luke 7, 29-30, as well as Josephus' Jewish Wars 1:110. So this proposed understanding of hupanaman as those following a strict interpretation of the law would suggest that Paul no longer follows the Pharisee sect. However, it could also indicate, as suggested by Rudolph, that he may adjust his approach to table fellowship when necessary. Thus, this phrase should not be taken to preclude a Torah-observant Paul. 1 Corinthians 9:20 can plausibly be read as Paul's interaction with diverse expressions of Judaism rather than as a rejection of his own Jewish identity with regard to Torah observance. So, in answer to the questions raised by the presence of hupanaman in 9:20, Paul uses the group descriptor those under the law to designate those living under a strict halakhic interpretation of the Pharisees. How does Paul become as one under the law? He does this by sharing table fellowship with those who hold to these strict standards, and he himself follows them on those occasions. What does he mean when he claims he is not under the law? Paul is no longer following the strict halachot of the Pharisees. So, when Paul says he becomes as one under the law, he is saying that he adapts to the Pharisees' traditions when fellowshipping and eating with them. Paul does not personally adhere to these traditions, which is why he says that he is not personally under the law. However, Paul accommodated those under the law so as not to put an obstacle in the way of the gospel. That is to say, Paul would abide by the Pharisees' interpretations of the law, including their extra-biblical traditions, even though he personally did not abide by their rules in regular life. For whatever it is worth, we look at 1 Corinthians 9 verses 19 through 23 in greater detail in our teaching What is the Law of Christ? We would also recommend our teaching Matters of Opinion, Romans 14. The bottom line is, first, there is no textual evidence that Paul is merely trying to appease the Jews in Acts 21. Such a notion is just assumed and read into the text, but the text itself gives no indication of this idea. Second, the very idea that Paul kept the law only for the purpose of appeasing Jews is a misreading of 1 Corinthians 9. The evidence within 1 Corinthians 9 itself demonstrates that Paul kept the law all the time and believed that it was authoritative and applicable to his readers. In 1 Corinthians 9:20, Paul becoming as one under the law likely means that he accommodated Pharisaic tradition during shared meals. Thus, it is clear that Paul's evangelistic strategy described in 1 Corinthians 9 is not applicable to the situation Luke describes in Acts 21. Once again, the most straightforward reading of Acts 21, which does not require importing any prior assumptions into the text, is that the rumor is indeed false. Paul did not teach believers to abandon the law of Moses, and he went to some length to reassure the believers in Jerusalem of this fact. What about Gentile believers? One more verse requires our attention in Acts 21. After James instructs Paul to participate in a vow and temple worship to debunk the false rumor that he was unfaithful to the law, James says the following. Acts 21, verse 25, "But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality." Here, James reiterates the Jerusalem Council's decision given earlier in Acts 15:20. Some have taken this statement from James to mean that, while there is an expectation that Jewish Christians would continue to obey the law of Moses, Gentile Christians need only keep 4 laws. John MacArthur articulates this perspective. Quote, "By urging this course of action on Paul's part, the elders were by no means abrogating the decree of the Jerusalem Council regarding Gentiles. Gentiles were not to be required to observe the ceremonies and rituals of the Mosaic Law. To make that absolutely clear, James summarized the decision of the council that Gentiles were only required to abstain from meat sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from fornication. Since Paul was Jewish, his participation in the ceremony would not violate that decision. So, according to MacArthur, verse 25 is meant to clarify that Paul's actions do not suggest that Gentile Christians must follow the law of Moses beyond 4 laws. But is that an accurate interpretation of James' statement? Is James really implying that while Jewish Christians, including Paul, are free to be Torah observant, Gentile Christians are not expected to advance beyond these 4 laws in their walk of faith? That interpretation might be possible only if one approaches Acts 21, verse 25 with an inaccurate understanding of what was decided at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. To give some context, in Acts 15, the apostles reached the decision that newly converted Gentile believers were not required to be circumcised and keep the whole law of Moses to be saved and welcomed into the Christian community. Both Jews and Gentiles are saved by grace through faith in the Messiah, not through circumcision or law observance. Therefore, according to the apostles, the Gentile believers should be received into the community without having to be circumcised and taking on the entire law right away. However, it was still important to assure the Jewish believers that these Gentiles were genuinely committed to following the God of Israel. Therefore, James proposed that the Gentile believers should initially adhere to 4 fundamental laws derived from the Torah. The law of Moses already teaches that followers of the God of Israel, native Israelites and sojourners alike, should avoid eating meat offered to idols, blood, and things that have been strangled, and it also teaches that they should avoid sexual immorality. These are the same laws we see reiterated here in Acts 21, verse 25. Why these 4 laws? Well, because these issues were directly related to idolatrous worship practices. Thus, observing these laws was intended to show that the Gentile believers had fully renounced idolatry and embraced the God of Israel. Obviously, these 4 laws were not intended to be comprehensive, nor the only laws that Gentile believers needed to obey forever. For instance, nobody thinks Gentile Christians are allowed to murder, steal, or lie. Paul instructs his Gentile readers to obey many other commandments of the Torah beyond these 4 laws, including certain commands often characterized as ceremonial laws. For instance, in 1 Corinthians 5:8, Paul instructs his mostly Gentile audience to, quote, celebrate the festival of Passover. In light of these facts, the best approach to understanding these four laws in Acts 15:20 and 21:25 is to consider them as representing the starting point of fellowship. They were the initial requirements Gentile believers needed to follow so that they could join the synagogue community alongside Jewish believers. But the idea was not that the Gentile believers would stop at those four laws. The idea was that the new Gentile believers would learn and begin to apply the rest of God's laws as they continued attending synagogue services every Sabbath. This is clear from the conclusion of the apostles' ruling. Acts 15, verse 21. For from ancient generations Moses has had in every city those who proclaim him, for he is read every Sabbath in the synagogues. According to scholar Ajith Fernando, quote, James' concluding point in verse 21 was probably made to reassure the Christians who had come from the Pharisees and who wanted to see the Torah taught among the Gentiles. He says that this was happening in the synagogues in every city each Sabbath. For more on the Gentile believers' relationship to the Torah, see our teachings Acts 15, Obedience or Legalism, and Is the Torah for Gentiles too? So, the Jerusalem Council ruled that Gentile believers should be embraced as full members of the synagogue community without first being circumcised. The four Torah laws imposed upon the Gentiles were meant to serve as a starting point for fellowship, showing that they had turned away from idolatry and were committed to the God of Israel. Then, as they attended synagogue services every Sabbath, the Gentile believers would be taught the rest of God's laws. That is what the apostles' judgment in Acts 15 was about, and that is what James has in mind when he references that judgment in Acts 21, verse 25. He is not suggesting that Gentiles do not need to advance beyond four laws in their spiritual walk. He is simply reiterating what was already decided. Gentiles need to comply with four laws so that they can join the synagogue community alongside Jewish believers and hear the Torah taught every Sabbath. So why does James restate the Jerusalem Council's ruling in this context? Remember, James and Paul are addressing Jewish concerns about Paul's ministry. The Jewish believers had heard rumors that Paul taught believers to abandon the law of Moses. It is likely that James brings up the Jerusalem Council's decision in order to address Jewish concerns about Paul's ministry to the Gentiles. The Jerusalem Council's decision, which Paul himself endorsed and delivered to various churches, provides additional proof that Paul is not permitting the diaspora communities to become lawless or infected with idolatry. So, because Paul abides by the Jerusalem Council's decision, the Jewish believers can rest assured that Paul's ministry to the Gentiles would not corrupt the Christian communities, as Robert Wall writes. Quote, this repetition of James' verdict provides a narrative prompt for a review of Paul's mission in Acts. At no time has Paul allowed the pollutions of idols to contaminate a Jewish identity in the congregations of the diaspora church. So, in Acts 21, verse 25, James does not intend to define all that's required of Gentile believers in contrast to what's required of Jewish believers. The Jerusalem Council's ruling was that Gentiles must renounce idolatrous practices to join the synagogue community. James cites the Council's ruling, which Paul endorsed, as additional proof that Paul's ministry would not lead to spiritual compromise. The fact that Paul agrees with this ruling reinforces that Paul is not teaching against the law. In conclusion, Acts 21 reveals that decades after Yeshua's resurrection, thousands of Jewish Christians in Jerusalem remained zealous for the law of Moses. However, a rumor had spread that Paul taught believers to forsake the law. When confronted with this rumor during his visit to Jerusalem, Paul did not confirm it. Instead, Paul took specific actions to demonstrate that the rumor was false and that he remained faithful to the law. Paul's actions were not designed to deceive the Jerusalem Christians. Paul was consistently obedient to the law, and he repeatedly affirms this throughout the book of Acts. James' mention of the Jerusalem Council's decision in verse 25 is a reminder to Jewish believers that Paul's ministry to Gentiles would not lead to idolatry and lawlessness. We pray you have been blessed by this teaching, and remember, continue to test everything. Shalom.
119 Ministries has produced hundreds of biblical teachings, and now you can own all of them on one physical device. We're excited to announce that our entire video library in HD quality is now available on a flash drive. This drive can be plugged into your PC, phone, tablet, or anything else with a USB or USB-C port. The drive also contains written transcripts of our teachings for those who prefer to read rather than watch. Of course, we still offer all of our material for free at testeverything.net, but having a physical copy will allow you to watch our videos anywhere and anytime without the need for an internet connection. Having a physical copy will also ensure that our teachings are available if we are ever removed from video websites, which is a danger that ministries around the world are facing more and more. We want to continue to reach as many people as possible. Now, you might be asking, but what about all the new teachings released every week? Well, in addition to receiving all our past teachings, your purchase comes with free updates for life. Each flash drive comes with instructions that will allow you to easily download and store new teachings as they are released. Or mail us in the flash drive once a year, and we will update it for you and send it back at no charge to you. We hope you are blessed by this new resource. And as always, any proceeds our ministry receives goes right back into producing more teachings. Get your 119 flash drive today by going to 119flashDrive.com.